So welcome to everyone, and the gift of your presence, and it is a gift. I am Phil Callahan, and a member of the Coalition for the Protection of PEI Land, who along with the Coalition of PEI Water and the National Farmers Union are hosting this event this afternoon. First, we acknowledge that we meet on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Now it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Julie Pelletier Lush. Julie is a Mi'kmaq, an actor and best-selling author of the book My Mi'kmaq Mother. Much of her work centers on Mi'kmaq legends. Julie writes, acts, and does photography to preserve the history and culture of the Mi'kmaq for future generations. On February the 5th, last week, Julie was named as the province's first Mi'kmaq Poet Laureate. We now invite Julie to open this afternoon with a prayer and a song.
This is the first bit of writing that I've done since the appointment, so this one is very, very special to me. I call it the Prayer for the Earth Changers. Creator, I humbly pray, give my eyes the teaching of truth so that I can see what is really there in front of me every day. Give my legs the teaching of humility so I know when to stand up for things and when to sit down. Give my mind the teaching of wisdom so I know with clarity what is right and what is wrong. Give my ears the teaching of honesty so I can hear the truth even when it's hard. Give my soul the teaching of courage so that I can be brave and be who I really am, which includes fighting for what I believe in. Give my heart the teachings of love so that I have a reason to stand up and fight for what is right. Give my toes respect. Let me learn that without all things must have a value. Without toes, it is very hard to walk. So even the smallest of things must have our respect. Give us our hands, the gift of creation, so that we can all create beautiful things. Give our mouths the gift of strength, so we can always say what needs to be said. Give our shoulders the gift of balance, so we do not get burdened down by things we do not need to carry. Give our fingers the gift of connection. Interlocked with another makes us stronger and grounds us to each other. Let these teachings and gifts come into our bodies so we can be true to ourselves and be the change that the world needs right now. Tahoe. Now that was the Strong Woman song for all of the amazing women here I see today, and also to celebrate the men who help give us strength in all the things that we pursue. Walalio, thank you.
It is now again my privilege to introduce to you the moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Carolyn Peach Brown is an associate professor and UPEI's Director of Environmental Studies.
Based on the turnout today, I would say that this is a very topical discussion that's going to be had today through our various panelists, and then for all of you as you discuss at the tables. And so it's my privilege to be here to moderate this. So I will now hand the microphone over to Senator Griffin so she can bring what she has prepared for us today.
And starting right off the top, I'd like to thank my uncle Urban Laughlin, who taught me public speaking in 4-H club. Land has always been a big issue for all of us in Prince Edward Island, but sometimes one can just get so jaded about hearing about it that I think people tune out. So it's great to see such a great crowd. Shortly after I became chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Agriculture and Forestry, we released a report related to farmland ownership in Canada. But I'm going to warn you right at the start, I'm not going to focus exclusively on the problem of foreign investment in land, though that did come up in our study, because I think there's many other factors that were brought to our attention which will help shed some light on why land in Canada, as well as Prince Edward Island, of course, is such a hot ticket item. So on this slide, you see the cover page of our report, and it's called A Growing Concern, How to Keep Farmland in the Hands of Canadian Farmers. So we looked at the acquisition of farmland and its potential impact on the farming sector. We set out to find the reasons behind the increasing value of farmland and to hear the concerns and challenges that are faced by the agricultural stakeholders and to propose some possible solutions. Farms are growing in size, and that is certainly a piece of the land use and land ownership puzzle. I thought this particular graph that illustrates how the sizes of farms in Canada have been changing. If we take a look at what has been happening between 1956 and 2011, we see that the number of farms has declined significantly by 64%. So over the same period, we've had a slight increase in the total amount of farm area, a decline, or a slight decrease, I should say, in the total amount of farm area, and that decline is about 8%. So overall, in Canada, we have fewer farms, we have larger farms. Incidentally, in terms of a mega trend, over the same period, farm cash receipts increased about 20-fold. So smaller numbers of farms, larger farms, and much more productive farms is what we were told by Statistics Canada. The 2016 census of agriculture showed that the total number of farms went down by 5.9% from 2011 to 16. And the total farm area went down by 0.9%. So this particular graph was provided to us by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. It shows what I think we all knew, but it's helpful to see the data. The value per acre of land in Canada has gone up, way up. Our committee identified 3 categories of issues that might explain this increase. One is economic issues, second is environmental issues, and the third is demographic issues. So economic issues included economic growth in the agricultural sector and foreign investment. So regarding growth, we heard that as commodity prices have increased, so too have farmers' incomes. Higher incomes and lower interest rates have resulted in a relatively high demand for farmland. We heard from farmers who were concerned that non-agricultural interests like financial institutions, pension funds, private investment firms, and private companies were investing in farmland. And as Don Mazer, who was then president of the Keystone Agricultural Producers of Manitoba, said, quote, "These investors represent an increased number of actors seeking to purchase farmland, thus increasing demand and prices." End of quote. This one was a bit of a surprise to me. Anyway, regarding environmental issues contributing to the increase in farm prices, we heard that purchase of farmland by conservation groups like Ducks Unlimited Canada or the Nature Conservancy of Canada was also contributing to higher prices. I personally find that rather hard to believe, but it's what we heard. And the reason why I find it hard to believe is that we're usually looking for wetland and woodland and non-farmland. But anyway, that's the perception. So be it. In Prince Edward Island, the 3-year crop rotation is a complicating factor, according to Mary Robinson, who was then the president of the Prince Edward Island Federation of Agriculture. She told our committee, quote, "It is not a hindrance so much as it poses challenges for people who have their operations set up to crop a certain acreage. Let's say, for example, of potatoes. If you're set up to grow 500 acres of potatoes and you were on a 2-year rotation, you could do that with 1,000 arable acres. But with the 3-year mandatory rotation act, you suddenly need to have 1,500 acres of land because you need to have that row crop only one in every 3 years. In British Columbia, land is being purchased for carbon sequestration, either for carbon credits or as a statement of public trust. And of course, changes in the climate itself is having an impact on land prices. For example, repeated flooding in some areas has stabilized farmland prices. And I'm sure you've all seen the CBC News every spring with the flooding that has occurred in some of the prairie provinces in recent years. And further, as Alan Howard from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada notes, the analysis, I quote, "The analysis of the land use and soils data indicates that farmland is being lost to urban expansion in Canada every year, with much of this occurring in Ontario, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, and British Columbia, where the majority of Canada's best farmland is found. And land is sometimes sold for urban development because it can fetch a better price." But anyway, Ron Bonnett of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture told our committee, and I quote, "Continued low interest rates, when coupled with the cash receipts, have led to competitive farmland markets in many regions and multiple bids on many properties, creating a seller's market." So we heard several problems that farmers face in accessing farmland, which we categorized into financial capacity, types of land ownership, and profitability of the agricultural sector. And financial capability problems included concerns about the ability of young farmers to get into the market when land prices are so high. And established farmers are also carrying more debt, which is a concern because markets, interest rates, and exchange rates can change rapidly, but mortgage payments do not. And the best farmland in Canada is in southern Canada, and therefore close to the urban centres where prices are high. And developing less desirable land, of course, requires drainage, rock picking, and fertilizer use. The lack of infrastructure, for example, broadband internet in remote areas can make farming more difficult, and I know we can relate to that here in Prince Edward Island. Types of land ownership was also a complicating factor. Land leasing can be more accessible for new farmers, and they sometimes lease from other farmers who buy land and lease part of it back to minimize their risk. But retired farmers also lease their land, and farmland that is purchased by investment funds is rented or leased. So farmers have told us that they worry that renting rather than owning makes farmers employees rather than owners. And it exposes them to the real risk of rising rent rates. There is further concern that this could also result in more large-scale versus family farms. The community dynamic is also going to be impacted by the renting of land. Andre Magnan, associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Studies at the University of Regina, told us that investment funds are mostly concerned with return on investment and not the community, while landowners invest in the community. In New Brunswick, some farmland has been abandoned because there is inadequate infrastructure. Scott Ross of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture told us, quote, "The drivers of it are primarily a lack of appropriate infrastructure in the area and other primary processing facilities or other infrastructure or nearby production to make it economical for farmers in the area to really break that land again and bring it back into production. Primarily, we've seen it as a result of poor economics in some situations, and then the lack of appropriate infrastructure in the area to really make it a viable investment for farmers in nearby areas." He said that the abandoned land is now covered with forest, so converting it back to agricultural land is going to be really costly. Before I share our recommendations, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that land use is primarily under provincial and municipal jurisdiction. Our recommendations are therefore to the federal government and are therefore somewhat limited in scope, and I apologize for that. So we poked our nose in as best we could. Our first recommendation is directly to the Government of Canada, and it was that Finance Canada explore the possibility of increasing the amount of lifetime capital gains exemption for qualified farm property owner, or for qualified farm property to make it easier for new farmers to acquire farmland. Right now, the lifetime capital gains exemption is $1 million, but considering how large farms are now and how valuable they are, this should be revisited. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that 1 million is too little. Our second recommendation was that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Statistics Canada, and Natural Resources Canada continue to cooperate to improve the data on the classification and use of farmland. In other words, keep talking to each other, departments. Further, in that same recommendation, we recommended that federal departments better cooperate with the provincial governments in order to keep them informed about technological advances in imaging and remote sensing, and the way in which the resulting soil maps could assist provincial land use planning. So our third recommendation was that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, why do government departments never have short names? Anyway, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada renew the funding for the National Research Project on Farmland Protection through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So our fourth recommendation was that the federal government work with its provincial counterparts to take advantage of initiatives such as the National Research Project on Farmland Protection in order to enhance the tools to better track land transactions. Our final recommendation was that the federal and provincial governments work together to protect and promote the use of land for agricultural purposes. Now, I have one slide that's not in our report. This is related to the global situation. So I wanted to share some of what we know about the global situation. This particular image which of course you can't read, but you can see that there's various shades of dark. The darker means there's more investment, the lighter means there's less. So this image is from a Bloomberg article entitled, "How China is Buying Its Way into Europe." So according to their research, China has bought or invested at least $318 billion in Europe over the past 10 years. And much of this investment is in science and technology companies, but Chinese companies are also buying up property in Europe. 8/10 of the largest acquirers were state-owned or backed. Think about that. The state-owned or backed the companies that were acquiring this land. So this has been raising red flags at the European Union, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Emmanuel Macron would like to see a strategy to deal with this phenomenon, while governments in Greece, Portugal, and Cyprus welcome the investment. So there's the dichotomy.
So I'd like to call on Douglas Campbell now to come in and give his presentation.
It certainly is great to see the amount of people here and taking an issue that is of concern so seriously. So my talk today is around the Lands Protection Act and what effect land grabbing is having on that. The land grab is a worldwide phenomenon that is greatly impacting the landscape of Prince Edward Island. The island should be protected from this phenomenon by the 1982 Lands Protection Act, a forward-thinking piece of legislation of spirit and intent and law to ensure islanders retain the right to the ownership and the use of their land. The Lands Protection Act is constitutional. Islanders have the right to determine the ownership of their limited primary resource. We have a right to guard its stewardship for present and future generations of islanders. Ownership and control of the island land has been an ongoing saga since the British claim to ownership through defeat of the French in 1759. Of course, neither the French nor the English concerned themselves with the ethics of taking the land of the Mi'kmaq people. How ironic this point is when one thinks of where we stand today with the current land grab. Force has been replaced with underhand tactics. The British Crown surveyed the island into 67 lots and gave them away in a lottery to its war creditors, with the understanding they would settle the lots with tenants. This move began the turbulent land issue. It would take confederation with Canada to buy out the absentee landowners and make islanders owners rather than tenants of their land. But the battle never ended. Non-islanders, corporations, and developers continually seek after island waterfront land for subdivision purposes, the farmland for vertical integration food processors, for food processor purposes. Various restrictions were introduced over the decades with little or no enforcement. The legislation, with true spirit and intent, came in the form of the 1982 Lands Protection Act, which is the envy of many jurisdictions. However, from the day it was implemented, a variety of people began the process of figuring out how to circumvent the act for their own ends. Included in that list of people would be sellers wanting top dollar for their property, regardless of the impact on current and future generations. But can we really blame them? For many farmers, the land was and is their retirement fund. It is why more creative ways than mere restrictions have to be found to protect our primary resource. Corporations and individuals have their lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents, most of whom are islanders, ever searching out the loopholes in the letter of the law to circumvent its spirit and intent. Successive island governments have permitted the spirit and the intent of the Lands Protection Act to be continually violated. In turn, they tell the public that the letter of the law is being followed. Is that a lie? Technically, perhaps not, but its spirit and intent certainly has. Successive island governments have done nothing to strengthen the act and close loopholes. One excuse is that the corporations have more lawyers than does the government. You would think that once a loophole is found, the government would move to close it. That's if they were faithful to the spirit and the intent of the act. The reality is, Cabinet has the final say if a land deal goes through. Yet, there are many instances of them ignoring the recommendations of IRAC and approving land transactions in clear violation of the Lands Act. This leaves us to wonder how much our cabinet ministers are even educated on the Act and what their motives are in allowing deals to go through that are in direct opposition to the intent and the spirit of the law. The gift of jurisdiction, our island province, is the name Horace Carver gave to his 2013 report on the Commission on the Lands Protection Act. Mr. Carver points out that, and I quote, "While the purpose of the Act is clear and easy to understand, the legislative framework consisting of the Act and the regulations is very complex and difficult to understand even for those who deal with it on a regular basis. Few individuals and corporations make applications or even complete mandatory reports without help from accountants and lawyers." End of quote. Therefore, should the fate of our land be placed in the hands of Cabinet? For some time now, the National Farmers Union has been sounding the alarm bells about the land grab in this province and the disregard for the spirit and intent of the 1982 Lands Protection Act that is resulting in an alarming consolidation of island land into fewer and fewer hands. Why this matters is perhaps best stated again by Horace Carver, and I quote, "This province cannot withstand the effects of land grabbing experienced elsewhere in the world. We need the Lands Protection Act to protect us from the incredible wealth of people who live just beyond our borders and see our land as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold like silver and gold." End of quote. Mr. Carver also stated, and again I quote, "The time is here, if indeed it has not already passed, for creative, wise, and visionary leadership to try new and perhaps even some old ideas on how to protect, enhance, sustain, and assist our rural communities and our agricultural industry." End of quote. That was 6 years ago. And we have not seen the visionary leadership. We have not seen the effort to protect or sustain our rural communities and agricultural industry. What we have seen is the ramping up of the land grab by foreign, on and off island corporations and individuals not interested in playing by the rules. For the most part, the alarm being put forth by the NFU has fallen on deaf ears, particularly because of the lack of transparency in revealing what entities are holding island land. The lack of transparency also allows for the belief by many islanders that the land laws were being followed and upheld. However, there appears to be a gradual awakening in recent months, which is perhaps connected to the concern around our water and the corporate demand of unlimited use of it through deep water wells and holding ponds. There has also been more recent transparency in the database, and islanders are beginning to see in their own communities the day-to-day results of the land grab. Also, the NFU would argue the corporations have become bolder in their transactions, in the justified belief that government will not stand in the way of their wants. After all, government wants investment and jobs, and are held ransom to the politics of fear. We've all heard it. Give us what we want or we'll move our jobs elsewhere. The NFU feels it would be fair to say farmers, as producers, have been pushed to the brink by going head-to-head with processors to whom they are selling. It is getting difficult to hold on to the belief that a true and fair return can be earned. The awakening is coming, but islanders can't afford for it to be a gradual awakening because time is running out. In fact, if it hasn't already. If we as islanders and our government don't soon stand for the land, there will be no stopping the land grab. And once again, islanders will be tenants, or worse yet, unable to afford to live in their own province or in their own communities. The NFU has in many talks with politicians from all political stripes been clearly told that the land will not be an issue in the soon-to-be-called provincial election unless islanders make it so. An example of how determined politicians are to back away from the issue is the recent no-show of 3 candidates running for the PC leadership at the NFU Forum on Land. It is also very evident in the recent hearings of the House of Assembly Select Standing Committee on Communities, Land and Environment, which proved to be a farce. In November of 2017, the NFU made a presentation to the Committee on Land Grabbing. As a result, the committee moved a motion to invite 3 entities to appear before them to disclose their land holdings. Now, 16 months later, Vanco Farms has not yet appeared. In November of 2018, Robert Irving of Cavendish Farms made it clear in his appearance that he had an hour of time to dedicate to the committee hearing. He revealed nothing regarding Cavendish's farm's land holdings, which are used to grow potatoes in direct competition to his contract growers, the very thing the Lands Protection Act was to prevent. Rather, Mr. Irving was allowed by the committee in his brief appearance to push his own agenda. In a fall, when potato farmers struggled to get the crop out due to weather conditions, Mr. Irving stated the need for the land laws to be changed so that farmers could double their acreage to supply more potatoes to the New Annan processing plant. He also pushed his argument for lifting the moratorium on deepwater wells. Not one question was asked by the committee on how much land the Irvings own and control before Chair Kathleen Casey abruptly brought the meeting to a close. The third entity asked to appear was the Great Enlightenment Buddhist Institute Society, or known as JEBUS. Committee member Liberal MLA Alan Roach, after 2 attempts, successfully passed a motion that JEBUS not appear before the committee to explain land holdings on the basis of it appearing racist. The land is the issue here, not racism. But it appears to be an advantageous playing card for those wishing to close down discussion when it comes to the transparency of Asian investors in Prince Edward Island. By not asking the questions out of fear, our land suffers as the island is being sold off incrementally. An example of not asking questions when one should have been was on JEBUS's ability to develop 3 separate properties located side by side, totaling 195 acres, deemed agriculture when purchased. The records show it was still zoned agriculture when the building of a monastery was begun. Then suddenly an application came to government to rezone it commercial and was approved by Cabinet. Had the rules of the Land Protection Act been followed, this could not have occurred. If the government supported the act, it would have ordered building cease rather than rezone. Richard Brown, Minister of Communities, Land and Environment, has ordered IRAC to investigate PEI land holdings by corporations and individuals. Apparently, it is to be due in April. It is the opinion of the NFU that government, through IRAC, already knows this information, and the delay is allowing for yet more land grabbing and abuse of the legislation. You may not like this next part then, but the NFU believes Richard Brown is the closest ally we have when it comes to political will to address the land issue. But it is questionable if he has the support of the McLaughlin government. When Iraq brings back their report and their suggestions, will government implement them, or will Premier McLaughlin again state the letter of the law is being followed and allow the land grabbing to continue? The Lands Protection Act has been reviewed numerous times since its inception. Before we give concrete examples of how the Lands Protection Act is being violated and by whom, let's look at what the Act says in regard to ownership limits regarding farmland. Mr. Carver is right in that the rules and regulations of the Act are complicated, which begs the question, is there any need for it to be so complicated? In the simplest of terms, the Act states that an individual is limited to 1,000 acres of total land holdings. A corporation having 3 equal shareholders is limited to 3,000 acres. Under the law, a food processor is only supposed to have 5 acres to carry out test plots. The best known example of abuse and circumventing the spirit and intent of the Lands Protection Act is by the potato processor Cavendish Farms, owned by the Irvings. As processors, Cavendish Farms is entitled under the law to 5 acres for test plots. Through interlocking companies, the Irvings own and control an unknown amount of agricultural land. It is yet to be known if the amount they control will be revealed in the impending Iraq report. By using the loopholes in the Act, which governments have made no move to close, the processor has been able to profit through land grabbing at the expense of island farmers, and all islanders in general, but can say they have stayed within the letter of the law. The current situation that is unfolding as we speak is around 2,200 acres of prime potato land in the Badek area. It has been a known fact since the fall of 2018 throughout the agricultural community that Irvings purchased the land. But the recently opened up database of Iraq shows that there was not until February of 2019 that an application was made to Iraq to purchase the land by Indian River Farms, Long River Farms, and Galloway Farms, all with Irving family members, shareholders. Galloway Farms, with Rebecca Irving as the sole shareholder, only became a registered corporation on February the 5th of this year. An application by Galloway Farms to buy just over 1,000 acres of land from the said farm in Badek was made February the 12th. Islanders have no way of knowing what the recommendation of Iraq to Cabinet concerning the sale will be, or whether it will come up at the next Cabinet meeting. However, it is likely safe to say the Irvings are feeling pretty confident in the letter of the law. The evidence is there that if politicians continue to follow only the letter of the law, which is the literal meaning of what the law says in writing, Islanders risk losing our gift of jurisdiction. Islanders elect their politicians to represent the majority and the greater good, not the corporations or the land grabbers. We can no longer allow our politicians to say the letter of the law is being followed. This is an excuse to do nothing. A government that governs only by the letter of the law no longer governs for the people, but governs for the few, the wealthy, the corporations, and the self-interest, and becomes corrupt, leaving authoritarian-style rule which turns leadership into dictatorship. There is a saying that we've all heard. If you look after the land, it will look after you. But there is another saying. When the farm is having a hard time financially, the land is the first thing to suffer. Farmers know this. The land grab by corporations and processors is making this very evident. Here on the island, contract growers are receiving the lowest margins on their returns in the country, Farmers are forced to cash crop the land between the potato years, resulting in less cover crop and less organic matter to hold the moisture and the soil. Recently, a survey was conducted among potato growers, showing the vast majority in favor of the Lands Protection Act and keeping the acreage limit where it is. They see the need for the act to protect them from the land grabbing and processors having more control over their farms and livelihoods. But they need help. The land needs help. The NFU cannot solve this problem. The Coalition for the Protection of PEI Land cannot solve this problem. The solution comes from our politicians. They, and they alone, have the power to fix the land grabbing phenomenon that is impacting our island. Politicians have to have the political will to do what's best for the land. The time is now to make politicians accountable on such an important issue. Thank you.
I'm going to be just a tiny bit positive at the beginning here in terms of the impact that the NFU, I think, has already had on this particular issue, because there were times, and it could have been going on for years, where someone could come into the province, bring a trailer onto a piece of land they want to get, stay there during the summer for 6 months, call themselves an islander and buy it, and there would be no information given to IRAC or anybody else in terms of whether this was the appropriate thing to do. So there is a new definition now of resident person. They must be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident and maintained a principal residence on PEI for 1 year and the 2 years leading up to the purchase. So that's making it a little bit more difficult. IRAC is being much more determined to make sure that there is actually advertising that goes on when land becomes available. I know of a couple of incidences where young farmers were leasing land from older farmers with the idea that when the older farm family wanted to get out, that the young farmer would have a chance to buy the land, which makes sense. And then all of a sudden, the young farmers found that their farm had been sold to an Amish family that had come in from Ontario. So this is the kind of thing, again, that IRAC is trying to make sure it works a little bit better in terms of there being proper advertising so that when land is being sold, islanders have the first chance at getting it. They've also launched investigations, principally in Kings County, down around where I live, principally having to do with Asian purchases of land. So they are trying to get more information there. And of course, the new data bank that Douglas made reference to is now online, where you can go to the to IRAC and actually put the name of a corporation or a person's name in, and you'll see a list of all the purchases that have been made over the years. And there's one other issue that IRAC has asked the government to look at, and this is, I know there have been some people that were doing some research in Kings County, and they discovered purchase of a land where there might be like 20 or 25 buyers, each with a less than 5 acre amount in terms of purchasing the land. And IRAC has asked the government to bring in regulations that would prevent this from happening. I sometimes wonder whether this issue is losing its steam as PEI becomes more urbanized. There are a lot of families now that are 2, 3, 4 generations away from the farm, and the issue of who owns how much land just may not be that important to them. I mean, they all shop at these wonderful food palaces and go in. Food prices are very reasonable, choices from all over the world. It's pretty hard to get worked up about whether food production is in trouble, because it's certainly, from all the evidence that they see, it isn't. I did want to quote just a little bit from some speeches from the throne, because I think this tells us a little bit about how governments, and to some extent islanders, have changed over the last 30, 40 years or so in terms of how they view this issue. And if we listen to this is from a 1972 speech from the throne. Running through the history of Prince Edward Island is a strong iron thread of permanence and stability, made up of our family farms and the agricultural community made possible by the family farm. The very nature and character of this province is built upon the nature and character of our farming community. That's really nice. And this is what people said back in 1972, and it was, I think, generally accepted. And I wanted to just add something else that came from that time. Premier Campbell said at a federal provincial conference in 72, he said, quote, "We in Prince Edward Island have no intention of allowing our province, through attrition, neglect, or oversight, to end up in the hands of non-residents who have little interest in the communities of our province, little concern for the preservation of our way of life, little involvement in our island institutions, and who may simply view the province as the place to spend a holiday or opt out of the urbanized society." So that's back in 1972. Now, from 1982, we hear, historically, islanders have had a special concern with the ownership and use of land. My government believes in policies that make land ownership available to the maximum number of islanders. And one of the things I've been thinking about leading up to writing the speech and this whole issue, and it's going to be something I'll mention a couple of times, what would Angus think if he looked around today to see what was going on, if he heard the concerns of what Douglas had mentioned and what Diane's mentioned? What would he think? But now we're facing a somewhat different kind of issue, aren't we? And we do worry about lawyers and accountants and so on getting creative in terms of working around the law. And I'm going to speak just a little bit about GBIS because I think this presents a very particular type of problem that I think PEI has never faced before. You essentially have a non-profit community welfare corporation is kind of how they describe themselves, coming into PEI. They come from something called the Pure Land tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and one of their goals is to purify the land. They view organic farming as very important, that people are becoming unhealthy with the way that food is being produced. And I think for many of us probably in the room, when we initially heard that, we thought, that's not a bad idea. You know, we have had concerns about commercial farming and what it might be doing to the land, and all of a sudden there's this group coming in that seems to be saying all of the right things. And I know the initial farms that they bought, honestly, were farms that was beat up tobacco land in Heatherdale. There was a hog farmer towards Bridgetown. These were farmers that wanted to get out. There was no great demand for their land. No one wanted to buy it. And this group came along and purchased it. So I think we've all had to kind of come to terms, and I know amongst the community I live in, it's very divided. There's some who think that they're doing really important work and that it's about time that somebody took care of the land. Others have much greater concerns about it. And we know that within their particular tradition, the Bliss and Wisdom group, the GBIS group, buying land is something that the followers are asked to do. The issue has become how much land, and the fact that the land, nothing is being done with it. And I think that this becomes an issue that I think the political parties, we as islanders, the government has to start dealing with. Because if hundreds and hundreds, thousands of acres that used to be productive farmland are not being used anymore, this is certainly not with the spirit and the intent of the Lands Protection Act. Is there some way that we can compel a large landowner like that to make sure that the land gets used? Do you give 10 years, you know, that must, over that 10-year period, should they have to start farming the land or leasing it out to somebody else who will? And I certainly think if there's perhaps one issue that I'll be looking for leading up to the next provincial election, this issue of land banking, I think, is very much on top of it. We have a very interesting, vibrant group of young farmers that really want to go out and try their hand at farming, and we need to give them a chance to do that. And I think the only way that that can happen really is through land banking. PEI used to do this, and I think it's time that PEI did it again. But the other thing that I want you to think about is, do we need to think about land use as well as land ownership? My concern is that even if we get this right, which is going to be a challenge, it may not be enough, because we may be able to control who owns how much land, but if we don't start talking about and thinking about how we're going to manage land use, then it may all be for naught. And again, I wanted to go back to 1971. There was a commission at that point. And just listen to this. This was their recommendation after they'd studied all this issue of land ownership and so on. The commission recommended development of detailed land use plans for all land in a strip 1/2 mile in depth around the entire shoreline, creation of detailed community land use plans, and a process to facilitate public participation in the creation and administration of such plans. Beyond these specific recommendations, the Commission urged the provincial government to foster and enforce a stewardship ethic with respect to land. Landowners would be required to meet minimum standards of land management, including preventing erosion, enhancing soil fertility, maintaining buildings and fences in good repair, and those who did not would pay an annual maintenance fee. This particular commission was trying to refocus everybody's attention from land ownership to land use. But very quickly, and we can all wonder, I don't know exactly why, but very quickly governments sort of ditched that and went back to this idea of land ownership. Any of us that follow agriculture and our soils being in trouble, we know that we really need to turn this around. And again, it goes back to this issue of farm incomes, that the idea of having forage and grasses that would provide the organic matter and improve soils, it's been replaced with soybean because farmers need the money. Okay, I'm going to go quick. I think anything that comes along with land use issues we need to think about creative ways of paying farmers to do that. And if you look at what goes on in Europe, they're very clear in their agricultural policy. They pay billions of dollars every year to farmers who do and farm properly. And I would argue that PEI is much more akin to Europe in terms of our density of population, in terms of how there's a limited amount of farmland. We've been so spoiled in Canada in terms of farmland. There's always another half acre or another section that's out there that can be farmed. But I think on PEI, we have very particular issues that are more akin to Europe. And as I say, the Europeans are quite clear that if you're going to control land use, you must compensate farmers to do that. And I think that's something that we need to do as well. Okay, I'll shut up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. I get to be the bad guy, and that's why I have the green and the red cards to enforce the time. So, given the tremendous turnout here today, the organizers have decided to change the format a little bit. Originally, they had planned to have people get together at the tables and talk about specific questions, and there were designated people at each table to lead that discussion. But given the fact that there's many people who are out in the hallway and many people sitting around the side, there's no way that we can fit everybody at tables to have those discussions. So instead what they've decided is that we'll have an open question and answer period for about 45 minutes.
My name is, Roy Johnstone, Argyle Shore. I have a comment and a question for the Senator, Diane Griffin. I was kind of surprised to see that your map was of Europe, Asian ownership in Europe. And I'm wondering if the Senate is planning to look at foreign ownership in Canada and create a map similar so we know what's going on?
Well, it wouldn't be the Senate that would actually do the mapping, but it would be one or more of the federal departments that would do that. Generally, though, what they're looking at are such things as soils and the crops that are on the land. But it's not a bad idea, and I suspect in Stats Canada they probably have a very good set of information on ownership. I personally don't have that, but try Stats Can. They've got lots of great stuff on their website. But you're asking specifically about the amount of ownership now that's non-Canadian. So I'll see if I can get that information.
I love the idea of land banking. Okay, I think that's important. But I think it's more than just important for farmers. And I'm speaking personally here. I have 3 daughters, and none of them live in PEI. They've left this island and gone away for 5 to 10 years, and they want to move back. They don't want to move back to Stratford. They want to move back to rural PEI. And they want to have land. They want to have 5 to 10 acres of land where they can raise their family like I was raised in BC, back at Cardigan, right? So we talk about rural development, and we talk about land grab, but you then talk about islanders. When my daughter, who's been away for 5 years after university, tried to buy 4 acres of land in Cardigan PEI, she's identified as a non-islander.
And I know that a huge issue globally, Asia, Africa, etc., is land grabbing is happening all across the world in terms of basically getting land, stealing land, or taking land away from indigenous or native populations and actually moving it from meeting their own needs to more of a monoculture export-driven model. That's happening globally, and the onslaught is large. And we're also losing the genetic diversity in terms of crops and things because we're moving towards much more control in terms of seeds and patents and control in that way. And we also are seeing right now unprecedented environmental collapse. I just talked to someone recently about the recent study about the collapse of insects, what's happening to bees. The IPCC report tells us we have 12 years. If we don't do that, then we're going to have unprecedented climate change. And in all that context, this is happening on PEI. But I think we need to look at the bigger picture of what's happening because we have the most unequal wealth distribution in the history of the planet right now in terms of people owning it. And we also know that studies have shown that most food right now is being grown by smaller farmers locally, and that's where the most of the food is grown on the planet right now and meeting the needs, and there's been studies about that. At the same time, we have an unprecedented shift of people, and Reg Phelan, people probably knows with Via Campesino, moving from country to city because of the dispossession of land. We've seen that happen in Mexico in trade deals and other agreements which actually have consolidated more and more control at the top. But I don't think we can look at PEI without understanding that bigger picture, and I'd just like you to understand what's your response in terms of this as part of the global phenomenon that actually will lead to mass starvation if we don't deal with it, in my mind.